We are going to be drafting this dress, as you can see on the screen, on pattern, and as well as cut it out on fabric. So on this pattern paper, I already have my lines drawn out, the shoulder line, and then the shoulder to the chest line, the shoulder to the bust line, shoulder to the waistline, and then shoulder to the hip line, and of course the hem of the skirt. Now the shoulder to the bust that I'm using for this customer is 11 inches. So before we go into that, let's just mark what I have. This is the shoulder line, this is the chest, the bust line, the waistline, and then the hip line. So to get shoulder to the bust is 11 inches, shoulder to the waist is 17 inches, and then from the waist to the hip is 8 inches. And then this is the hem of the dress. So first of all, I'm going to mark the neck width. The neck width you are using for this customer is 3 inches. So on the shoulder line, I'll mark 3 inches, and then I'll take a neck depth. Mind you, the shoulder is 17, so half of that is 8.5. So that is how I mark half of the shoulder. So you mark half of the shoulder. After that, you mark the shoulder, you mark the neck width, and then you mark the shoulder slope. You come down by 1 inch, and then connect that to the neckline. And then for the back neck depth, we are using 1 inch for the back neck depth, and then for the front neck depth, I'm using 7 inches. And then the neck is going to be a V. So I'm just differentiating it by using broken lines, because I'm using this same pattern paper for both the front and the back. I'm drafting the front and the back together. The armhole depth is 7.5, and then we get the middle of the armhole depth and go in by ½ inch, because you are going to be marking both the front armhole and the back armhole. So on the chest line, I'll mark quarter of the bust circumference. The bust circumference we are working with is 36.5. So I'll mark half of that, and then also mark seam allowance, but that one is optional. So I just mark half of the bust circumference, and then I use my French curve to connect that to this middle of the armhole depth. So this is the back and armhole. Then to mark the front armhole, I'll go in by ½ inch on the middle of the armhole depth, and then from there I'll make my curve towards the armhole curve. So now I'm using broken lines to differentiate both of them, and then I connect to the shoulder line. So this is the front armhole. So note that to get the armhole depth is the bust circumference divided by 6 plus 1.5. So next I'm going to mark half of the nipple to nipple point. So you mark half of that, and then just mark it. Okay, so mark it on the chest line, the bust line, on the waistline, the hip line. This is to enable us to get the waist dart. So I want to mark the waist dart. That is why I am doing this right now. So after you have done marking, you take your long ruler, and then you connect all the lines together. At the waistline, we are going to be taking a waist dart of ½ inch on both sides of the line. We are taking ½ inch, so just mark ½ inch on both sides at the waistline. Then we are going to be connecting this in form of a triangle. So for the front pattern, from the bust we'll come down by 1 inch, and then from the hip we go up by 2 inches. That is the position of the dart. After which, just draw a triangle, to connect from the bust to the waist, and then the waist to the hip. And then for the back, so this is the front pattern. Then for the back pattern, we are going to go above the bust line. So we are going to be connected from the chest line. So from the chest line, we just connect to the waistline. So that is the difference between the front waist dart and the back waist dart. So this is the back waist dart. That's where the dart started from. So this is the hemline. Now we are going to be making that curve that we have. So before I do that, I'm just going to check the measurement, the bust circumference, and mark a quarter of it. Then add seam allowance. This is optional. You can add your seam allowance on your pattern, but if you know you forget, you can just do it on the paper. So you mark quarter of the waist circumference, then add 1 inch of the dart intake, and then seam allowance. Then we go to the hip line, quarter of the hip circumference, you mark it, and then you add seam allowance. Most times I always use 2 inches as my seam allowance. So at the hemline, whatever I have on the hip line, I will repeat it at the hemline. So I'll just measure what I have there and repeat it at the hem. So the next thing now is just to use my ruler to connect all those points together. So first of all, I just mark the exact, and after that I also indicated the seam allowance. So that is why you can see double lines there. One is for the actual measurement and the other is the seam allowance line. So the next thing now is to mark where the pocket will be. But before we do that, we are going to mark the curve. Remember that this dress has 2 side gathers. So that is what I want to mark now. So before I do that, that line, I'm going to extend it to the hem of the pattern. So that is why I'm remarking again. So I want to extend the line down. So after that, I just use my ruler to connect it. So I have a straight line all the way down to the hem. Then from the waistline, I just create the curve. So mine is starting from the waistline. So if you want yours to start from the waistline, then do exactly what I am doing. If not, you can always use your preference. So the curve for me is starting from the waistline. So for this dress, I actually use 3 yards of fabric. But if you want your gathers to come out very well, then you have to use 4 yards of fabric. But for this, I just managed 3 yards of fabric. And the dress for this also has a puff sleeve with elastic casing. So after drawing that curve, the next thing now is to mark the position of the pockets. So from the waistline, I just went down, by 2 inches and just mark where the pocket will be. So this is the pocket. So the next thing now is to cut it on fabric. So first of all, I'm going to cut the back pattern. Remember, on this pattern, I did not add zipper allowance. I'm going to be adding the zip allowance to the fabric. Okay, so I'm just remarking the paper, because after cutting out the paper, I don't want to get confused. So label your patterns very well. So and this is just me now cutting out the pattern so that we can proceed to cutting on fabric. So I'm cutting using the back measurement first. So this is the center front, and then this is the side. So always label your pattern so that you don't get confused. So after which I just cut. So this is the part we're going to be using for the gathers. We're going to be using a slash and spread for that. And this is a zip I'm going to be using. So this is the back pattern. Like I told you, you mark the zipper allowance first. Note I did not mark the zipper allowance on the paper. So I'm marking the zipper allowance on my fabric. I'm using 1.5 inches as my zipper allowance. So after marking it, I just use the ruler to connect it, and then I place the pattern on the fabric. Okay, so the pattern will start from the zip line or after the zip line. So that space you are seeing there is for the zipper. So the next thing now is to cut it out. So I'm just trying to connect the lines so that I don't get confused after cutting. So that is I've indicated the chest line, the waistline. So for the back, we are concerned, our major concern is the chest line, waistline, hip line, neckline. So after that, I just cut it out. So when you are cutting it out, add seam allowance to it. Add half-inch seam allowance to it so that you don't have any shortages. Then this is the neckline, 1 inch. I also add seam allowance to the neckline and to the shoulder line, half-inch seam allowance. After which I cut open the zipper line. This is where the zip will be, the center back. So I cut it open. So now I have 2 pieces. I'm also going to use this to cut on the line. So I'm just remarking on the other side of the fabric so that it will be easy for me to locate my dart, the waist dart later. Now to avoid zip bulge on the waistline, I'm going to go in by half-inch. I'll go in by half-inch, and then I will slant it towards the upper chest and also towards the down part, the hip line. This is to avoid zip bulge at the back of the dress. I just use my ruler to connect that like a triangle to blend with the fabric. So I'm just using pins to hold the fabrics together. So make sure that they are together before cutting. So after that, just use your scissors to trim out the part that you have already marked. From the hip line, just trim it towards the waist and then towards the chest line. So this will avoid zip bulge. So the next thing now is to cut the front pattern. So in order not to waste the fabric, just turn it. You see how I turn the pattern paper down so that I don't waste the fabric, because you are trying to manage these 3 years. So I've positioned the front pattern. So I'll pin it down, after which I'm going to cut it out, adding half-inch seam allowance to the sides. Half-inch seam allowance to the sides. So after doing that, now I'm now going to cut the neckline. I'm just following the pattern paper to cut out the neckline. It's a V-neck, and then left half-inch seam allowance on the shoulder line. After that, I recut the armhole. Remember that we went in by half-inch, so that is what I am trimming out now. I'm trimming out the half-inch that we went in by around the armhole. So we are done with the front pattern. We'll be using this to cut on the lining. So don't forget to transfer your dart to the fabric. So the next now is to use slash and spread method to cut on the gather. So you see, I'm trying to manage my fabric. My gathers is not so much because of the fabric that I have. So on the paper, first of all, just mark the spacing. You can use equal spacing for that, and then always indicate on your pattern paper the side that you are going to join to your skirt so that you don't get confused. And then you label what you have ruled, and then use your scissors to slash through. Okay, use your scissors to slash through. So for me, I have 5. Now we'll now place this on the fabric using equal spacing. So you see, I'm just trying to manage this fabric, so the intervals between them was not really much. So that is why I said, if you want your gathers to come out very well, then go for 4 yards of fabric for this style. But for me, I use just 3 yards. Now I'm using this down part to do this slash and spread, while the other part of the fabric will be for the sleeve. The sleeve is going to be a puffy gather sleeve with drawstring. So that is what the other part of the fabric is going to be for. In another video, I'll be showing you how I drafted the sleeve. So after spacing it out, I'm marking him. Don't forget to add seam allowance, after which you cut it out. So this is for both sides. It's for both sides. So just cut the other side open. It's for both sides. I'm just trying to trim it for it to be straight. So I'm marking the position of the pocket. From the waist, I went down by 2 inches to mark the position of the pocket. So that is where the pocket will start from. And just notch it, and then the opening of the pocket will be 7 inches, so it will stop around the hip line. So I've also marked and then notch it, so it will just be easy for me to locate the pocket later. Sorry about my voice, I have a little cough. So the next thing now is to cut out the pocket. So if you know that your fabric, the wrong side and the front side are close, always create markings on the fabric on the wrong side so that you don't get confused. So here I'm just trying to mark out the pocket. So for my pocket, I always like my pocket to be a bit deep, so I always use 11 inches deep, so you can work with your preference. And then for the wideness of the pocket, I'm using 8 inches because the original one is 7 inches. Half inch seam allowance at the sides, so I'm working with 8 inches. So that is what I'm just doing here, just marking out the pocket. And this is both pockets. So I'm just trying to smoothen out the fabric. I'm confirming my measurements. I'll confirm it, then trim out the rough edges so that the pocket will be neat, and then give it a little curve at the down part. So I'll just do same to the other side as well. Mark where the pocket will get to, and then trim off the excess and give it a little curve at the down part. So the pocket is ready. So you can see that is how. So this is the pattern. This is the front pattern. So this is how we are going to place the garter. This is the pocket. This is where the pocket will be. So we are through with the drafting. So I'll be showing you all the patterns. So this is the back pattern. I'm going to place it on the floor for you to see it very well. And we'll also cut lining for the center piece. So here is the pattern. You can see the front pattern. I've also attached the sleeve. I told you I'll be cutting the sleeve. So these are all the patterns. In my next video, I'll be doing the sewing process. I don't want this to be too long. See the lining on the center piece. Thanks for watching. See you in part 2.